Good morning, everyone. I'm Josephine Gotianun, Senior Programs Officer at MBC. Just a few reminders before we begin. For security reasons, we only sent meeting links to registrants. As a courtesy to other attendees and to help us recognize you if you have a question, please make sure your photo or video has your first and last name and organization. If you are not using a Microsoft account, you can edit your display name as you comment to the webinar. To avoid disruption and ensure connection stability, please keep your microphones and cameras off until our Q&A session. We encourage you to send in your questions early, even while the presentation is going on. You may send in your questions by typing them in the chat box. When we call on you for your question, we will turn your microphone on. Please state your name and organization before asking your question. Lastly, today's session is being recorded. We may use all or part of it in our platforms or publications. Now, before we begin, allow us to share a video from our partner, Microsoft.
How do we empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more?
It starts with one.
One employee.
One developer.
One organization.
From one employee to a team collaborating with another team.
From one organization to their customers, to their customers' customers.
Helping local communities, creating jobs, increasing productivity for the global economy.
Our society.
Our world.
That's the impact.
That's the impact.
That's the impact each of us can have.
That's our opportunity.
100,000 plus employees.
75 million organizations.
7 billion people on the planet.
100 to 75 to 7.
To make every small business more productive.
To make every large business more competitive.
To make nonprofits more effective.
To make government institutions more responsive.
To expand access to education.
To improve healthcare outcomes. And to amplify human ingenuity.
When we empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more, we empower the world.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining the last session of our Leading in Extraordinary Times series, a partnership with Microsoft, and our first membership event for 2021. We hope everyone had a restful and meaningful New Year. We are pleased to be joined by our board members, our Chairman Edgar Chua, our Vice Chairman Jaime Augusto Sobel de Ayala, Lito Taig and Itos Cruz, and Risa Mantaring. More board members are supposed to be attending shortly. Just a recap of our monthly sessions last year, the series started in August with Jaza on the speed, scale, and stamina needed to surmount this crisis. He was followed by Smart Communications President Al Pandillo on the Great Reboot, Unilever Philippines CEO Benji Yap on Malasakit for All, Pilipinas Shell CEO Cesar Romero on Purposeful Leadership Amidst Uncertainty, and Microsoft Country GM Andres Ortola on Purpose-Driven Innovation. Our last speaker for this series is Josephine Gotianun Yap, President and CEO of the Philinvest Group. Her presentation is pre-recorded to avoid connection interruption, and this will be followed by a live Q&A for 30 minutes. We organized this series last year, not just so that you could hear from a top leader, but so that you could talk with her and your other colleagues here. So please type in your questions early, even while Georgie is still speaking. May I now invite our chairman, Edgar Chua, for the opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Coco. And good morning, fellow MBC members, and a very happy new year. Welcome to our first event this year and the final session of MBC's Leading in Extraordinary Times series. 2020 was one of the most challenging, if not devastating, year in human history. Life, work, and our social fabric have been altered, disrupted, and in some cases destroyed. While the year ended with great news on the vaccine front, the public and private sectors now have to build the implementation plan that will take the vaccines from the airport when they arrive, stored, distributed, and injected into our arms. As well, the Philippines has not yet ordered this in the millions that other countries have, including some of our neighbors. This means that we will have an extended period of when people's lives and the economy can safely be restarted to achieve 2019 levels. The private sector has stepped up more than ever, and the past year has been a time of unprecedented public-private collaboration. As our previous 5 series speakers have shared, it has also been a time when CEOs and other executives needed to think about their families, their colleagues, their businesses, and their community all at the same time, bringing to the fore empathy and patriotism like never before. One of the best examples of this is today's speaker, Josephine Gotianun Yap, President and CEO of the Philinvest Group. Georgie stepped up immediately and throughout the year provided hers and her executives time, insights, leadership, and resources to fight against COVID and its effects. Like you, she did so while continuing to lead her company, and in her case, managing to produce growth and raise funds here and abroad. She has also done all of this very quietly, which makes us all the more thankful she agreed to talk with us today. As Coco said, Georgie recorded her remarks, but we will have live Q&A afterwards. So let me first greet Georgie. Welcome, Georgie, and Happy New Year.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to start the year with such a distinguished company.
Well, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and we look forward to your presentation.
Well, 2020 has been singular, and I hope that you will find my personal account engaging.
Okay, go ahead, Georgie. Please go ahead with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning and a happier new year to the leadership of MBC and its members, key movers of the Philippine economy. Now that we are in the 12th month of this pandemic, and since I'm the last speaker of the series on leading in extraordinary times, I'm sure most of you have by now heard all the leadership advice and have already developed your own leadership style under this new normal. So I thought I would just narrate my eyewitness account and personal journey during this pandemic. My generation are veterans of crises. If not for this pandemic which snuck up on us, this would have been our first crisis-free decade in business. Our generation's first initiation into business was the double whammy dollar moratorium coupled with a political crisis triggered by the Aquino assassination in the mid-80s. The 90s began with an economic fallout from a series of attempted military coups. Our financial acumen was developed from lessons learned during the prolonged Asian financial crisis and the Great Recession of 2008. These events all shaped our frame of mind when confronted with the annus horribilis of 2020. This time, we are challenged by a global economic and health crisis. Luckily for our country, the strong mandate of the Duterte administration kept it from turning into a political crisis, unlike what has happened in the US. Not to be taken lightly, but this may be one of the most critical factors that allowed for a more unified response against COVID in our country. I was commuting regularly to Singapore during the first quarter when Singapore was experiencing its first wave and had more COVID cases than Manila then. This gave me an early insight into COVID-19. Once the pandemic hit Manila, Philinvest was ready, and we immediately formed our crisis mitigation teams, which range from digitization, cash flow management, sanitation, and testing protocols, among others. This allowed us to seamlessly continue our operations and support our customers in FLI communities, East West Bank branches, and the electric cooperatives in Mindanao. My assessment of this crisis was that it differed because we could not isolate or protect the business purely through financial measures. The widespread impact of public health was so intertwined with the economy, and the pandemic's global ramification, which affected our overseas customers, made it even more daunting. As such, We felt we would only survive this if we are able to manage the public health issue first and foremost. I believe many of you in private sector came to the same conclusion and reached out to participate in the greatest public-private partnership project ever. It is surely the fastest and most impressive PPP of any administration. Philinvest and the Gotianun Foundation set aside a 100 million war chest for this effort. I recall cold calling a cabinet secretary and offered to provide a dashboard and data warehouse for COVID cases. I was very uncomfortable that we didn't have the same data feed that I got used to reading daily provided by the Singapore Ministry of Health. The Philinvest City Foundation offered to provide it at no expense to the government. And given the urgency of the situation, several agencies started working with our designated data science and analytics provider, Thinking Machines. In less than 2 weeks, the DOH COVID-19 dashboard and data warehouse was up by April 13. But the depth of the problem was much deeper since our healthcare infrastructure has been neglected by many administrations over the years. There was no central reporting system in place, and we continued to work to piece together data from various ad hoc reporting systems. While there was much to be improved in terms of timeliness and accuracy of data, we had to adapt in an agile fashion, work with what was available, and continue to improve it along the way. Our Philinvest IT team found themselves developing CDRS, a data repository system, which proved to be the most effective in capturing laboratory data. The substance of the data was always sufficient for strategy and decision-making, but has continued to improve over time. Perfection would have been the enemy of progress. We are thankful that despite the pandemic, the Philinvest Group has still registered a 3% growth as of the third quarter of 2020. This was a result not of pandemic reactive measures, but of decisions made many years ago, lessons learned from previous crises. It was a combination of diversification strategies and financial prudence. We balanced the cyclical and defensive segments of our business, and we managed our leverage and spread out our maturities. We also learned that because we lived up to our commitments to our banks and bond investors during the Asian crisis, they in turn continue to support us in future crises. During these times, setting aside a cash hoard is imperative. FDC went about raising a US $200 million bond issue and FLI an 8 billion local bond issue at favorable rates as evidence of the investors' continued trust in our group. The formation of the IETF was a great relief. I found myself involved in the T3 task force, Test, Trace, and Treat, headed by Vince Dison. It was a public-private coalition team tasked to increase testing capacity. Aside from government agencies, we had McKinsey working pro bono to project manage, together with the Philippine Disaster Resilience Foundation and Ayala, Philinvest, and ThinkWell, among many others. I personally witnessed how the testing czar got the private sector, which included many of you here, to help increase the testing capacity from 4,000 to 90,000. Go Negocio, led by Joey Concepcion and other organizations, were very involved. This could never have been done without private sector involvement, given the government's bureaucratic procurement policies. In the early stages, I found it worth my time to join the daily 30-minute stand-up calls where we witnessed how the team tackled all the obstacles that would have kept T3 from reaching its objectives. The COVID war had to be fought on many fronts. Yes, there were many. They lobbied for laws to fund the testing and other initiatives by providing data and scientific information. They created LGU playbooks to use quarantine centers instead of their homes for isolation and taught them how to manage granularized lockdowns. They worked to do hotspot testing to eradicate spread at the grassroots levels. They designed communication campaigns to teach the public the right protocols. I personally found the most difficult was handling fake news and destructive criticism. I found myself disheartened at times. The T3 team were well aware of the problems that were raised by critics, but they needed time to master the resources and had to solve the problems by prioritization. Definitely for me, a first-hand knowledge of the IATF plans and seeing their direction and the materialization of their plans gave me relief that the public health issue was on the road to being under control. Today, the Philippines is no longer the highest in the region, and new cases and positivity rates are lower. We have done a much better job than most of the world's richer and more developed economies, despite having some of the world's most densely populated cities and a healthcare infrastructure that leaves much room for improvement. The main arena now is balancing COVID containment through social discipline while reopening the economy. This COVID crisis brought out a whole new set of lessons and insights. First was the need for constant learning and agility combined. In a crisis where the enemy is not only invisible, but unfamiliar, you need to be one step ahead. The right knowledge allows you to develop your plans and the agility to change and adjust those plans quickly when new information comes to light. Our business plans have taken a shorter and more agile approach, ready to adjust them and anticipate possible curveballs. While we have been more selective in new property launches, we have accelerated the new facet of our business, which is in the environmentally sustainable investments, such as recycled water, desalination, solar roof panels, district cooling with our partners NG and Hitachi. On the banking side, East West out of prudence set aside 3 times their previous year's allowances to ensure financial strength in anticipation of possible credit losses. Our most hard-hit industry, hospitality, had to reinvent itself to be relevant during COVID times. Second is the need for empathy. With personal health at risk, it is no longer purely business. Workplace and customer safety become our first and basic responsibility. When designing our workplace and testing protocols, we started by taking a survey so we could understand not only our workers' health and working conditions and the risks involved, but also their living conditions and the likelihood of contracting COVID in their homes, and the pertinent risks to the older family members they lived with. At the height of the first wave, we kept in mind the mental health of our employees by rolling out e-learning, leadership training, and even a rosary brigade. Our FLI property management team adjusted to new needs of our homeowners, including health and sanitation screening and delivery markets. Early in the pandemic, we were approached by the RITM frontliners for living quarters. We fixed up the Palms Country Club for them. We were surprised by the overwhelming public approval from the social media. Somehow, the letter we wrote informing the members went viral. More establishments opened their doors to the healthcare workers going forward. It is this empathy that made us offer the use of the Philinvest tent as a quarantine center without being asked, and recently to allow its further expansion. The Philinvest Group also recently committed to a 100,000 vaccine order. Third is understanding accelerated transformation. This starts with the transformation of mindsets internally and among our leaders. We were gladly relieved that our early investments in IT infrastructure provided the foundation to allow us to communicate with our customers and our East West Bank FLI team to work from home. We are now even more convinced that we need to move faster towards digital transformation and preparing not only for today's customers, but also for the customers of tomorrow. During the pandemic, East West launched Como, the very first digital bank approved by the BSP for a local universal bank, together with a slew of digital products to make banking easier. We are also rolling out the first phase of the smart city infrastructure in Philinvest City in anticipation of what sustainable communities will expect in the future, a plan that actually started even before the pandemic. Lastly, this crisis of global scale is a sign of things to come, the coming of a new emerging market century. It highlighted the regions of emerging countries with access to less scientific and financial resources could surpass those of more developed economies in such a critical endeavor. That there is a place for societies with greater social discipline and concern for the common good to create a more sustainable world. I learned the importance of unity and social responsibility in times of crisis. I feel elated when citizens of other countries express to me their admiration for the Philippine private sector involvement. I learned that finding ways to help and participate was more effective and useful to society. There will always be time for stating what could have been done better in hindsight. But in a pandemic, working together, helping, and moving fast is more crucial. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that excellent presentation, Georgie. I'm going to ask a couple of questions before we go to the Q&A. For the attendees who are with us today, if you have any questions or comments, please type them in the chat box and we'll get to them once we get to the Q&A. Georgie, I was very interested to hear you say that this could have been or would have been the first decade or one of the few decades that we've had without a crisis. Do you think that the crises are going to become more constant now?
Well, I think everybody has predicted that over the coming years we are going to see more and more of this healthcare type pandemic. So I think we should be prepared for it. I think when I was in Singapore, they were talking about the number of years between previously and then what happened to SARS, what happened to MERS, and then now. So it just gives signal to the government that we have to put in a very strong healthcare system to address that. Similar to, I think, what Thailand had. So I think Thailand's advantage was they had a very widespread, strong healthcare infrastructure.
When you read or hear about those countries, a lot of them say they benefited from the fact that they were hit hard by SARS and MERS, and therefore more prepared for this. I guess the reverse silver lining in our case is that we were not hit so hard. So maybe that's part of the reason we were not prepared. Do you think, what do you think are the most important things we need to put in place so that we will be prepared for the next one, if and when it happens?
There's one thing that I found out was because our healthcare system is divulged to all the different LGUs, right? We don't have a centralized CDC. So I think that's what made it very difficult, because every LGU would do things their way, and then they didn't have the same infrastructure that they could work on. So I think that we probably have to put in a centralized CDC that can at least orchestrate anything that if these things happen again, right?
I don't know how devolved the health systems are in other countries, but I think many of us are surprised, and correct me if I'm wrong, when we began to realize that the DOH had, I guess, certainly for pandemic times, less control than we would have wanted over the local units. Would you have any reflections on that?
Yes, that's exactly what I meant. Is that you don't have a centralized agency that can oversee the whole and also who knows it very well, right? Who knows this whole pandemic, how to handle it, and then who has a very good reporting system out there, because in pandemic the data is one of the most critical things. So we really need to have that, because I think the vaccination, we do have some kind of infrastructure in place because we've been doing vaccinations in the past, right? But for data nationwide, we don't have that, as well as having going choosing the right direction and everybody following the right direction. I mean, so many people had so many ideas because the COVID was so unfamiliar, right? And it's all the ideas were just created a lot of difficulty, I think.
I was privileged to sit in on some of the meetings where you were there, and I could tell both from your questions and sometimes you would give answers how deeply you were studying this issue. Possibly one of the deepest thinkers, I think, among the CEOs that I would encounter. At what point, and like you said, it's just so unfamiliar, I guess, that all this data was coming in and we couldn't structure it in our brains yet. At what point did you begin to feel that you had a handle on the situation, data-wise?
I think data-wise, probably maybe 1 month, 1.5 months into after the data dashboard was built up, it started to get there. But you have to remember that in April, when we started the data dashboard, there were very few laboratories only. So you can imagine that the 90,000 testing capacity was only built over the next 3-4 months. So there was not much data to gather in the beginning. And then later on, you had to then suddenly get all of these newly accredited laboratories. So they're still trying to do their operations, learn new things. At the same time, you're trying to get them to report the data, right? So they had a very difficult time just allocating people to do data encoding, etc. So I think so when we did the CDRS, that was one of the times when the data started to become much better. We got all the data down to the barangay level, so everything became much clearer. But I have to say, in general, the data was always sufficient enough for strategy and decision making.
How are you using this data now, the data that is already currently available now? How do you use it, for example? Could you give us an example of how you use this data in your planning, in your strategy, in your operations?
I normally use this data, I mean, on a personal level. I only use this data usually. I warn some of our branches. For example, when I say that it looks like, it's going up in that area, please be careful, please be more cautious. Maybe you can talk to the local government in that area to look at certain barangays, things like that. But really, it's really the T3 and the IATF who uses this data. So the thing is, the data is late, because by the time it comes out, it's already spreading, right? So you really you may be able to see that it's going to go up, but yet you won't. By the time you see it going up, it's kind of hard to stop it already, right? So until you do a lockdown.
Thanks very much. We're going to go to Q&A now, and my colleague Genevieve is going to assist us there. Genevieve?
Yes, thank you, Coco. We do have a question from Mr. Zubel de Ayala. Jaza, what's your question?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Hi, Georgie. Thanks very much for taking the time. And I've been a witness to Georgie's engagement from the very first day. It's been a pleasure working with her, not only on this issue, but on so many others, Georgie, and delighted to see you here. Georgie, a question to you. You've been very involved from the very beginning with coming up with unusual and more imaginative solutions to many of the healthcare issues that the country has faced, and your own corporation has been involved. I'm curious, as you go into 2021 and 2022, are you changing the amount of capital, resources, people you're putting onto the healthcare side of your operations, or are you leaving it to independent entities to handle that? I say it only because many of us are wrestling. Is this a new element of responsibility we will all have to take on as institutions with a lot of employees? Or do we just count on independent parties handling it? I'm curious as to how you're seeing this from your group perspective. Thank you, Georgie.
Yeah, well, definitely, we have had to set aside a part of our budget for handling COVID. So whether it was testing or other or all the other mitigation measures, we have had to set aside a budget. But we normally will just work with a third party to do this for us. We would we would find a testing partner, or we would find sanitation and sanitation partners, etc., to do these things with us. But it's also a big dent. Even construction, there's always a COVID budget now in construction.
Jazza, would you have a follow-up to that?
That's okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Georgie.
Thanks very much. Jaime was talking about, Georgie Jaime was talking about moving capital to medical or health issues. You mentioned in your presentation additional investments in the sustainability side. Could you tell us what inspired that?
Well, that started not because of the COVID. We started the very first one was we built we now have the largest district cooling system in the Philippines, right? In Philinvest City, Northgate Cyber Zone. So I was a true believer that going down the road, we would need more and more of this type of investments, because we find ourselves, some of our businesses, in areas where there is no water. So we're looking at desalination. And then also water cost is also going up. So we're looking at recycling the water, so that, for example, all the toilets of the office buildings can just be connected to the recycled water, and that would save businesses quite a bit. And so we've been looking at many of these things. Solar roof panels, we've done a few with NG, and it's really, I think it's nothing new. Even the whole world has been going into the renewables and these eco-friendly type investments.
Thanks very much. I'd like to shift to one of your topics, which is empathy, which Mr. Chua also mentioned. And as you said, many of the, if not all, of the attendees here probably have developed a new style or adjusted their style of leadership. Could you tell us, in your case, how you've changed your style of leadership because of COVID?
I think everybody knows that in general, the Philinvest Group is a very low-profile group. And the truth is, I very, very rarely make public speeches. So believe it or not, I'm rather shy. So,
which is why thank you very much for agreeing to do this. You, ladies and gentlemen, Georgie was a hard sell to do this, but thank you very much for agreeing.
But I think that because of the COVID, something snapped in me. I was really obsessed with COVID. I read about COVID all the time at night, and I just felt I had to do something about it because I was so uncomfortable. I wanted to be sure that, that something would happen, and I thought I needed to be there to just help in whatever way. So I guess that's what the pandemic did.
So in other words, you wanted to know all the information that you could figure out from this. But in terms of your management and leadership style, how did that change?
I think that in all of us had to have a more personal contact with our people, in the sense that when we met with them, we didn't just talk about business, right? Because normally that's what happens. We really then now talk about making sure that they're in good health. I mean, we went to the extent of finding out who among our people live with elderly people. So if they had an elderly companion in the house, our policies tried to protect them, tried to protect their elderly family members, allowing them to work from home and things like that. So we really took a careful survey of all of their personal things, like who they live with, what was their working environment. We made sure that all the frontliners who lived in very socially distanced, challenged environments were the ones that were tested very often. And it turned out right, because those were the people that would tend to be COVID positive. And I think we were one of the early adopters as well of Stay Safe. And I always tell people that the very first day that we adopted Stay Safe, we immediately caught a COVID suspect. And because of catching that COVID suspect, we immediately did close contact tracing in the company, and we found several other people, and we were able to isolate them. So we did a lot of these things, which is just to make sure the workplace is safe.
So you had ROI on your Stay Safe within 1 day.
Yeah, exactly.
Some of you did send in some questions ahead of today's session, but if others have questions, please post them there. I'll turn to Genevieve for those questions.
All right, thanks, Coco. So from the management style, we'll shift over to some operational practices. Ms. Joji, can you share with us some changes in your operations prompted by COVID crisis, which you think your company will most likely adopt permanently? For instance, have your workplace arrangements changed for the long term, or do you think you will revert to the old normal once we have surpassed this crisis?
Well, I think many of us have had a significant portion of our workforce now working from home. So I think that that's something we can probably look at, although people have to also eventually go back, because there's nothing that nothing can replace, this personal meetings as well and all that. But definitely you can have less people in the office given that. The other thing is, when we started, we also went into dual shift. But I think dual shift is just something we would do for the pandemic, but not really something we would adopt in the long run, So I think people also realize that there are things that you really don't need. And so there are some cost savings that you probably can keep going forward, People don't have to travel that much, right? And other and I think people also realize that. So it's an easier sell now to cut your cost.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Joji. Now we do have some members who also want to ask their questions. May I call on RRR? You do have a question for Ms. Joji.
Good morning, Georgie. If I may take advantage of your research and interest in this disease and looking forward to the vaccines, I guess many of us are still struggling with the question of should we push for very active availment of vaccines or not? And one of the aspects that has intrigued me, maybe rather belatedly, but for those who are following it more closely, maybe this is an old recognition. Is it correct? Is my understanding correct that all three of the leading vaccines, the Pfizer, the Moderna, and the AstraZeneca, provide nearly 100% assurance that those who take the vaccine will not suffer severe illness and will almost certainly not require hospitalization, and therefore will very likely not die from the COVID? Because to my mind, if this is so, if there's nearly 100% assurance of this, then there seems to be no reason why not avail of the vaccine as early as it is available to all of us. Is that your understanding as well? And is that the correct interpretation? And is that the attitude you're taking towards people who seek your advice?
First, I don't give medical advice. That's one thing.
No,
All I
based on your understanding.
all I can say is I will take the vaccine. That's all I can say. And it is voluntary. So we will make it available to our to people who want to take the vaccine. Right? So I think though a lot of people are interested in taking the vaccine because I think they're concerned. I think the Philippine population in general is very fearful of the pandemic in comparison to other countries, and so well, all I can say is I personally would take the vaccine because I'm very vulnerable, right? Because of my age, I'm quite vulnerable.
Well, if you're talking about your age, what about our age? Yeah, many of us are really rather vulnerable. Well, thank you. Thank you for that comment.
RR, do you have a follow-up?
No, I wonder, Jaime, if you have advice along these lines. I was just curious what your attitude is towards this, the vaccine. Are you also very aggressively interested in availing of the vaccine as early as possible?
This is to me, Ramon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just curious.
My feeling is maybe the word aggressive is not there. I'm a little bit more cautious. But I think like others, including Georgie, have mentioned, it is my intention that if I expect the organization to take the vaccine, then I have to take it myself. I've not been in a rush, I must admit. But yes, I do intend to take the vaccine when it's available. We put in a fairly large order for the AstraZeneca, whose technology follows the traditional method. It's not an RNA, and it's not, I guess, a synthetic shifting, I guess, of the molecules, but using a more traditional method. So if you ask me, for whatever it's worth, I'm comfortable taking it.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Our next question from our members is from Mr. Elmer La Peña. Mr. La Peña.
Yes, can you hear me?
Mr. La Peña, can you speak louder?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Hello.
Not very well.
I'm sorry, my audio is not so good. Can you just read my question?
Oh yeah, great. Mr. La Peña wrote his question in the chat, so here it is. Going back to sustainability, the ESG reporting of most companies exclude indoor air quality. Ms. Joji, what is your take on concerns on COVID survivability increasing with poor indoor air quality and affecting workplace safety?
Well, I have been doing some research, and I looked into this ultraviolet for the aircon, etc., etc. I was not able to find anything of great value as far as indoor air quality. The one that seemed to be really is just that you have to create more circulation, ventilation from outside. So it cannot be purely aircon. I mean, they advise you really to open up some of the windows so that there's more ventilation. But one of the things that I recently sent out to our people was that, well, we require our people to eat in their desks because we don't allow them to eat together. And but recently I told them we're gonna close the aircon during lunchtime. And then people cannot talk when they are eating. So that because I'm sure you heard about the Starbucks Korea situation, wherein because of the aircon, and then everybody got infected except for the 4 servers who had their face mask on. So I think that's my advice, because I couldn't find any other way to handle the indoor air quality.
All right. Thank you. Mr. La Peña, do you still want to add, or are we good?
Oh, No, I appreciate the answer. I think you're spot on with recommending good ventilation. And if you actually need a way to determine whether the ventilation is sufficient or not, we actually have a device that can do that. And I was wondering if you would consider that as part of your ESG reporting to determine the safety level of the indoors in all of the establishments.
All right.
Because
All right.
Janine, can I jump in?
Yes.
Since we were referring to malls, Georgie, could you tell us how that part of the business is doing now?
well, the mall business, of course, is very weak, right? Although the traffic has started to come up, I understand from the industry that maybe it's going up 30 to 40% of previous levels. But many malls as well have pick up counters where people can pick up their purchases. So we've done that as well. So then we've also instituted Stay Safe. But definitely in the meantime, it's going to take a while before the retail segment starts to go back to its previous levels.
Are you thinking of repurposing that space already or not yet?
Uh, I think in retail, that's always a constant thing. It's not really more so now with the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, I always tell people like retail is one industry that you're constantly, changing, repurposing, redoing. So it's just become more crucial these days to repurpose.
The last point that you raised in your presentation was about the new emerging market century. All these countries that I guess they're part in the spotlight now because of what's happening. Could you elaborate on that and tell us where you think the Philippines is in that comparison?
Well, I was really talking about more of the whole emerging market, China and the Southeast Asian countries, the African countries. I think it's there's been a lot of forecasts really that in the next century, all of these economies together will form a much bigger portion of the world GDP, right? I think Philippines, given the size of our population, we're really up there, right? We're in the top 15 now. And plus, before the pandemic, we were doing so well. And I think all the companies had great plans and we're all looking. So I'm just hoping we'll just get back there because we have some advantages, right? Our OFWs, our BPO industries, etc. So I think that as long as the corporate governance, the government governance, everything, economic governance is able to follow the right direction, that the country has a lot of positive things going for it.
Thank you very much. I'm going to call for final questions, and before I ask the final question, but if you have any, please write them in the chat box now. Before I ask the final questions, could I invite everyone to share your comments or your feedback via Microsoft Forms, which you can get by aiming your camera phone at the QR code that's being flashed on your screen now, or on the link that my colleagues are providing in the chat box. Please note that we may use your comments in our publications. For our last question, and Georgie, we could end with this, and maybe you can share some final words as well. What would be your biggest takeaway? You talked about 4 items there. What is your biggest takeaway or lesson from this crisis?
I think for the pandemic, the biggest takeaway, of course, would be that unity between it's really unprecedented, that unity between the public and the private sector. That really saved the day. And I think that's really extraordinary. And I think that, many of you in the group are part of that whole effort. And if it weren't for that, I think we would be in a much, much worse shape. So that's really my biggest take.
Thank you very much. On that note, if there are no other questions, I'd like to
Coco?
thank. Yes. Janine?
I believe Mr. Lachanco raised his hand earlier.
Go ahead.
Mr. Lachanco, do you have a question for Ms. Georgie?
Yeah, hi, Georgie. Thanks for doing this for us. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
No, I raised my hand when Ramon was bringing up the subject of the vaccines. It's just a simple question: are you planning to provide the vaccine to all your employees? And if you are you also planning to provide it to the families of the employees as well?
I think there is a NDA that covers the vaccine, and I think that we have to follow the DOH protocol. So I really don't know yet the details of that. So we probably have to hear that first before I can, make any statement to that effect.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much. Any final questions? If there's none, I'd like to thank Georgie Gotianun Yap for today as well, and Mr. Ed Shua for the opening remarks. Thank you to all of our members and guests for attending today's session and the previous sessions. We really appreciate your presence in the previous 6 months. Lastly, thank you to Microsoft Philippines, headed by its country general manager Andres Ortola, and to his team Bon, Ina, and Josh for sponsoring the series and for partnering with us. We look forward to working with you again soon. Good day to all of you. We look forward to seeing you again in our upcoming events. On behalf of the board and our MBC colleagues, thank you and Happy New Year. Thank you very much. Please stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Georgie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.